What's up guys, Justin here with TheSketchUpEssentials.com. So the presentations from SketchUp's Basecamp conference last year have landed on the SketchUp YouTube channel. However, it's a bunch of information, so what I've done is I've gone through and I've watched every presentation and summarized it so that you can figure out which ones you really need to watch. Let's go ahead and just jump into it. Okay, and so if you go to the SketchUp YouTube channel, which I'll link to in the notes down below, and you go to their videos tab, you can see all the videos that were uploaded from 3D Basecamp. There were a lot of really interesting presentations at Basecamp, but there's probably about 10 hours worth of content in here. I just picked that number out of the air, and you probably don't need to dig through all of that to figure out which one of these is going to be helpful to you. So I'm going to go through each one. I'll give you a quick summary of what was talked about, and then you can decide if you want to watch those videos. I'd also love to hear from you in the comments down below what your favorite video was from the Basecamp videos. Okay, so first up, we've got kind of a trifecta of videos, all from the same general group. So you've got your start to finish full structural plan set, you've got your integrating structural engineering with SketchUp, and you've got your efficient structural detailing videos right here. And so what I would recommend on this one is start with integrating structural engineering with SketchUp. And obviously these are going to be presentations having to do with actually creating structural plans and details in SketchUp. So they all have kind of the same players, but the integrating structural engineering with SketchUp is one where there's a conversation with Nick Sonder and Zachary Engineering about how they used SketchUp in order to create the actual structural details and plans of a project they did in Tahoe. So this one is kind of an overview of that process. And it's funny, these are the only 3 videos that were recorded live at 3D Basecamp. Everything else seems to have been recorded after the fact, which is fine. It actually gives the presenters a better opportunity to create a great presentation, but these are the 3 that are live. And so in this series, this first one, they talk about kind of how they tied everything together, right? Like how they tied the architectural model together with the site design and with the structural design and things like that. So I'd start here, see if this is something that you're interested in. If it is, you can dive a little bit deeper. There's 2 other videos. There's the start to finish building a full structural plan set. This is the guys at Zachary talking about how more the high level process of how they're building structural plans, which I actually found really interesting because I don't see a ton of people getting super in-depth with structural inside of SketchUp. It does happen, obviously, but seeing the overview of their process was really interesting to me. And so one of the things I liked with this presentation is they talked about how they're bringing in kind of pre-made details for things like door openings and shear walls and things like that, and then dropping them in the model. So instead of modeling them manually, what they're doing instead is they're using this process where they're using these pre-built details in order to kind of fill in different conditions inside of the model itself. But they really do kind of a full run through of how they're creating a structural set from SketchUp. So they literally go through and they talk about how they're getting everything into layout and how they're setting up those documents, and also some really interesting reporting things that they're doing as well, and then also kind of the templates that they're using in order to show those different details as well. So this is more the overall structural plan set. There's also another video in here about detailing itself. And so in the detailing video, they talk a lot more about how they're creating the 3D details that are then ending up on the plans. So if you've ever seen those 3D structural details that Nick Sonder does, this is going to be similar to that. And they talk through exactly how they're managing that in their document set. So if you are looking to do structural stuff, these 3 are actually really interesting. Probably one of the more in-depth run-throughs of structural that I've seen for SketchUp. Okay, so next up, if you have any interest in AI whatsoever, I've seen this presentation twice now from Daniel Tal and Jen Becker from Confluence, and they are doing the deepest dive into what's coming out in artificial intelligence right now of anyone I have ever seen. If you have even a remote interest in where things are going, the different technologies that are out there, other things like that, you should definitely check this out. They show you some tools that are absolutely going to blow your mind having to do with artificial intelligence. So if you just want to kind of drink from the fire hose a little bit, but just get an idea of kind of what's going on, and also how Confluence is actually using AI in their actual renderings themselves, this is definitely worth watching. This one to me is one I think just about everyone everyone should watch, just so you can be educated on what's going on with AI. So definitely check this one out, pretty much no matter who you are. Okay, so next up we've got Streamlining Site Logistics with SketchUp. So this presentation specifically has to do with using SketchUp for site logistics for construction, specifically large commercial. So this is Sarah Bruckert from Messer, and what she does is she creates really cool site logistics models. And so she talks about some really interesting things having to do with how you can import a site in, how you can basically model that existing site so that you can look at it logistically from a construction standpoint. So one tip that I really liked out of this presentation that I didn't realize you could do is she talks about how you can actually use the wall tool in 1001 Bit Tools, the extension, which is free, in order to quickly generate walls on a terrain. So you can actually draw walls on a terrain, which she's using in order to create construction fencing and stuff like that, but there's other functions in there as well. So she definitely gets in depth on how they're creating these awesome site logistics models, and she shows some pretty complex stuff. She shows logistics models that not only show like where people would move on the site and how they're setting that up, but also how they're setting up things like their models to show things like protection and other things like that. So if you do any kind of logistical modeling or you need to show complex sites, definitely worth checking out. So I mean, obviously if you're doing like interior designs or something like that, maybe you don't need this, but if you are working with any kind of commercial or large commercial and you want to do any logistical planning, this one is definitely geared towards that, and I think you're going to take away some valuable information. And so next we've got Points to Polygons, and you could probably guess this, but this is a presentation from Alex Schreier about how you can use point clouds in order to start creating models. So Alex has written several books about SketchUp. He's got a great YouTube channel. He gets really in depth on SketchUp concepts. He's a super smart guy, and he does a really good job of getting through this information. He also does a ton of lectures, so he's a great speaker as well. But what this tool is, or what this presentation is specifically, is it's talking through having to do with using point clouds in order to create models in SketchUp. So he's going to talk you through where those point clouds come from, and then some different ways that you can get that data into SketchUp itself, as well as some other tools for manipulating that data. So where this one is especially valuable, at least to me, is once you get a little further into the presentation, he actually talks about how he's bringing that point cloud data into SketchUp and then modeling from it. And this is something that when I wanted to learn a little bit more about point clouds, finding something where somebody actually models from a point cloud and how they're actually creating a model from that was actually a little bit difficult. So this is actually super valuable from that standpoint, because he actually does go through, not only shows you how to isolate different parts of the scan data, which is super important when you need to get into spaces and things like that, but he actually does talk through how he's isolating portions of the scan and then modeling from those as well. So I feel like the modeling from scans process is a little bit confusing, and so this is a really great overview of how you can start modeling from that point cloud data. Next up, we've got a fascinating presentation from Matt Wheeler, and this is a presentation about how he's using solid tools in SketchUp as a part of his workflow. And so his workflow is really interesting, but even if you only want to learn how to use solid tools, he's got some massively powerful tips in here for how you can use solids in order to join geometry and change geometry and other things like that. So his workflow itself is super interesting to me because of how heavily he's using solid modeling. So he's doing some things where he's actually creating his walls and all of his different levels as solids, and then kind of interacting them with different shapes and things like that. I'm not 100% bought into the process for everything, just because it's a little bit hard to wrap your mind around, but it's definitely one of the more big picture thought through workflows that I've seen for working with models in SketchUp. One bummer for me actually is Matt did a fantastic presentation as well, talking about how he's using Profile Builder in order to do things in the models. It doesn't appear to be in here, which is unfortunate because he's doing some really cool things with Profile Builder. But if you do any kind of modeling, you're not familiar with solids, or even if you are, I still recommend you watch this because it'll, if nothing else, it'll give you some ideas of how you can use solid tools. And I think that's an underutilized tool set in SketchUp. So really for anyone that's creating any kind of models, this is worth a watch if you have a little bit of extra time, just so you can learn a little bit more about those functions. And so you can also learn about how Matt's using this in his workflow, which is super, super interesting. And it's definitely going to make you think about the way that you model. Okay, so next up, the boathouse in the desert. So this is a little bit more of a case study of a set of plans that was created by a designer in Denver. So Micah Sexton is the presenter on this one. I met Micah at Basecamp, super nice dude, and he is doing some really cool stuff with his plans. So this presentation specifically, he talks through how he had kind of a desert location and how he created a set of plans for this location. So everything from the way that he created the site model and the context modeling and shadow studies, all the way through the way the model itself is working. So this is actually a really great presentation to give you some ideas of how you might take your documents to the next level. So some of the stuff that Mike has done in here, his plan sets are amazing. So a lot of what he's doing here, I would say, is probably on par with some of the stuff that Nick Sonder is doing. So just the quality of documents that he's generating are super, super great. Just looking at some of the visuals that he's created and other things like that. This is just kind of the pre-planning stages, right? And like the shadow planning and things like that. But these images look really awesome. But then he also gets into how he's using his central models and creating documents and layout from those. So he's got really great looking models, and then what he's doing is he's taking them over into layout. You can see the way that he's set those up so that they're ready to go over into layout, and just his plan sets look incredible in layout. So really for me, this one is worth watching just so you can see what he's doing with his plans, to get some ideas of how you could take your layout documents to the next level. So these are just super cool. I love seeing people that are really kind of pushing the envelope with what they can create from a visual standpoint, and I think Micah's definitely doing that. Okay, so now we've got a pair, and I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna skip a couple and then we'll come back, just because these are from the same presenter. So you've got the digital twins in retail, and then you've also got the gray boxing in SketchUp presentation right here. And so both of these presentations are from Joshua DeBruin, and what Joshua is doing is he's a designer that's visualizing retail spaces. And so the digital twins in retail is a presentation where he talks about going out and gathering the existing data of a space and then using SketchUp to visualize what that space might look like. And there's a little bit of overlap with his other presentation as well. But he talks about how he's taking these spaces, and this is one of those where he's actually got really good examples, so you can actually see like the full demo in here. But he's talking about how he's got measurements of different spaces and things like that, and he's using SketchUp to really quickly visualize what's going to go in those spaces from a design standpoint. So these are like storefronts for different retail spaces. And so one of the things he talks about in these presentations, which I think people could find extremely valuable, is he talks about how he's bringing in things like branding and other things like that. I mean, obviously a little bit later on he does talk about like placing products in the spaces and things like that, but I think where the real power is coming from for a lot of users is the way that he's bringing in these graphics packages and then quickly using SketchUp and layout in order to visualize how things are going to look from that standpoint. So one of the cool things that he does is in the middle of this he uses ChatGPT to come up with like a full branding process, right? So it comes up with different primary colors and different logos and things like that. He then brings those images into SketchUp and he uses them to set up the colors in SketchUp and the branding, as well as creating like signage and other things like that. So super powerful from that standpoint. He talks about how you can create all the custom colors, and then also how you can create your signage from the images right here. So, and he does it all very quickly, which is super cool. So if you're interested in anything like that, I think you're going to take a lot out of the way that he's bringing in that branding and setting up SketchUp with that. And then his other presentation has more to do with like gray boxing. And so what gray boxing is it's a method of figuring out where things are going to go using just very simple geometry. So he kind of talks about where that comes from, and then he gets into a little bit more of like how he's using it. And then again, he has a really good sample exercise where he kind of shows how he would use that in the real world. And so one of the things that I liked about this is seeing kind of his template down here of different shapes that he's using. So he's got all these colors kind of pre-set up with these simple shapes, and then he brings them in and he kind of resizes them. So he drops them into different spaces like this in order to see like, okay, this area is going to be whatever, this kind of retail, or this is going to be a display over here. And he uses it to kind of like lay that out really quickly in order to figure out what the space might look like without having to do a whole bunch of detailed geometry work. So definitely interesting. What I like about that is how fast it is and how you can go through iterations really quickly. So if you are iterating the way that things fit into a space, you might check out this gray boxing presentation. All right, so next up, I think this might be the only SketchUp for iPad presentation that made it into this set of presentations right here. So this is SketchUp's sketchbook from Dani. Dani, I'm sorry, it's Maupin, I think. So I met Dani at Basecamp, and I've known her through the forum as well. She is a super creative modeler that does pretty much all of her work on SketchUp for iPad, which is interesting to me. It's kind of like the opposite of the way that I work, because I mostly am using the desktop version. But what this presentation is this is super interesting because Dani has worked in like the theatrical spaces and the art spaces. So it's a little bit different than what a lot of us do, right? So it's not just like typical architecture or anything like that. She's creating these really creative models, and she's a really great modeler, and she's able to create these really creative things inside of SketchUp. And so this presentation is not necessarily like a tutorial as much as like her talking through her workflow and also teaching you how to be a little bit more imaginative, but also practical with the things that you're modeling. So she does talk about combining SketchUp for iPad with some other things as well, like Procreate, Morpholio Trace, that kind of thing. But just kind of a good overview of like her creative workflow. So if you want to see the way that somebody that works in a different space is kind of approaching 3D modeling, but also just kind of like using their imagination to create really cool things, this is definitely worth a watch. You know, I mean, obviously it's a little outside of like the landscape design, interior design, architecture, but seeing somebody who's so creative and just kind of how they approach creating 3D models, I think is it's really interesting to me as someone who doesn't lean creative. So if you're interested in that, you can definitely check out Dani's presentation. So it's also worth checking out her sketchbook thread on the SketchUp forums, which I will try to remember to link in the notes down below. But again, you can just see how this is all very creative stuff. So she creates really awesome models, definitely worth checking out. Okay, so next up we have everything you need to know you learned in architecture school. And so this is actually a really awesome presentation from Brenda Skeel, who owns B Square Design Studio. Basically, it's an architecture interior. It's a design firm. It's what it is, and they do some really interesting stuff with architectural design and interior design. However, where this one is super valuable is, I mean, there are architectural school pieces in here, but what I really liked about this presentation is she actually talks about things like how to bill for design and how to set up your billing and how to track your hours and things like that. Not in like a boring, like, great, we're going to talk about hours kind of way, but more like what the different phases in SketchUp should look like. So for example, she talks about, and this is one of the things that I found super interesting, for each one of the phases, she talks about like how long the phase should be and kind of like how much you should bill and things like that. So it's an awesome framework for how you should actually be like professionally billing your design, and how you should actually be making money. And I think obviously like a lot of us like working in 3D modeling software, but there's not always as much discussion about how actually money is made and things like that. So she goes through and she talks about examples of like, okay, in this early phase, we might move different spaces around so people can see the way that they kind of tie together. So what's contained in each phase, how much time should be in each phase, and how much should be charged for each phase, and kind of what those look like. So she gives you some really cool visuals of what the actual models at each stage is going to look like, and it's just a great overview of that process just in general. So this one is actually super interesting for me as someone who isn't necessarily a design professional, and just kind of like, hey, you should be organizing things in this way, and you should be thinking about things this way. She gives you like a sample proposal and budget breakdown of an idea of how you should be tracking each one of these phases right here, and you can figure out kind of how you set those ranges up and other things like that. Okay, so Cities from Scratch was actually one that I sat in on. This is from Eric Sargent. So you guys probably know Eric Sargent from the SketchUp YouTube channel and also SketchUp Campus. So Eric is an urban designer. He's very, very good with urban design, with like landscaping and sites and things like that. This was a super interesting presentation for me because I've always liked the visuals that Eric creates. Like he's very good at creating visuals that look both professional but also artistic at the same time. They convey information in a very like visually engaging way. And so one of the things that I found valuable here is what this presentation was, it was basically about how you can get the different data pieces and bring them together, right? Like how do you use the data? Where does the data come from? And how do you like tie these things together, right? So things like, where do you get this building data? Where do you get the road data and other things like that? And then how you tie all of that context together, right? How do you stack it together so that you get kind of like this visually engaging look? And so one of the things that was super valuable for me is he talked about like where he's getting different sources of data. So things like height maps and how you can use that in order to create sites, or topology or whatever. He actually talks through a project where he actually did this and kind of shows the result that he was able to create. It's actually pretty mind-blowing when you think about what he's been able to create. But he also talks about how you can bring in things like GIS data into SketchUp in order to quickly generate these kind of like cool verticals where you show the roads and you show the buildings, and then you can kind of overlay things on them and stuff like that. He shows you some really great places where you can get that GIS data as well, and then how you can bring that into SketchUp in order to create these really visually engaging views. So if you do any kind of urban planning or really anything with sites, it's usually a good idea to not miss what Eric has to say, because he is super educated in this area. Definitely worth checking out from that standpoint. And then you can kind of see at the end here just kind of the results that he's able to create and the different things that he's able to do. So this could definitely help you take your visuals to the next level. All right, so next up, we've got an interesting discussion between Mike Brightman and John Brock. And so these guys got together and they did a presentation where they talk about design and kind of like the collaboration that happens across a designer and then a builder, right? Like Mike Brightman is a home designer, so that he's a designer and an architect, while John Brock is a custom home builder, right? So he's written a book about SketchUp for construction. Mike's written a book about SketchUp for architecture. And so seeing these guys just kind of like chat together and kind of collaborate on something is super cool. So Mike talks about some of the things he's done with like bringing in zoning and setting up his sites with setbacks and other things like that, and kind of how to design that. And then John goes through and he talks a little bit more about how the different details and the way that things are set up and laid out in the model can create constructability issues and concerns, and kind of how to avoid those. So, you know, one great example for me, and something that you'd think that I would have thought about because I have a background as a general contractor, but the framing dimensions here for the studs behind your walls, he's saying use 4.5 inches instead of 3.5 inches, because then you can use 3 2x4s as opposed to having to rip a 1/2 inch strip of wood. So just things like that that make building construction a lot easier, and they're not always difficult changes to make, right? So just kind of make those changes and adjustments early, and it makes the builder's life a lot easier, which makes building the building a lot easier. So this is basically kind of that discussion of like, hey, there's different things in here that we need to think about when we're designing a building. So they kind of bounce back and forth, and then Mike talks a little bit more about kind of like his plan setup process and things like that. But it's just a really great discussion between two guys that know a lot about SketchUp and a lot about building, and just kind of how you can work together in order to get the process to flow from design to construction. Okay, and then sometimes SketchUp just gets used for some really cool stuff, right? And so sometimes it's just kind of cool to see one of those use cases. In this case, we've got the crime scenes and forensics in SketchUp from Joshua Cohen, and he's been doing this a while now, because I remember watching a presentation about this from Josh back at Basecamp 2018. But basically what he does in this presentation is he talks about how they're using SketchUp for different like legal cases and crime scene cases. So how they're coming in and they're capturing spaces, right? And then how they use that in order to visualize different things, you know, how different things went down when crimes were committed, where different evidence was found, things like that. So he talks through kind of how they're bringing in different data sources, you know, and then what's admissible in court, things like that, and also how they're kind of like tying everything together to show like how something might have progressed in a space, right? So they've got these really interesting characters that they kind of move around, but first they have to get an accurate depiction of the existing space and what's in there and how they're doing that. So, I mean, obviously this is kind of a unique use of SketchUp, but it's really cool seeing the way that people are using the program. And so if you're just looking for kind of like a cool use case of SketchUp and how it's being used in an area that you might not expect, this is definitely a presentation that's worth checking out from that standpoint. All right, and then finally we've got SketchUp for event design. And so this one's exactly what you would expect. It's Jim Lammers from Trinity Animation. He's talking about how they were able to use SketchUp in order to plan out a massive event at the Kansas City Chiefs Stadium. And so specifically he talks about like how they had to bring in all of these different spaces and then plan for them, right? So probably the first half of this is talking about how they were able to visualize the existing space in here and model that out. And then the second half is talking a little bit more about how they could set up the furniture and everything else for visualizing what's going on in that space. And that's kind of a recurring theme across most of these presentations is bringing in data. You know, how do you use that data in order to create something that you can work from? And then once you've done that, right, once you've modeled out that existing space, how you can actually make those spaces or fill in those spaces with the things that you need for your event or whatever you're doing. So he talks about some interesting things about creating different textures from the spaces that are out there and how you can use that in order to make those look even more like the existing spaces, as well as some kind of like entourage and furniture delivery and other things like that. So definitely an interesting case study of how SketchUp was used for kind of a unique use case and how you could use that in order to visualize those existing spaces. All right, so that should give you an idea of all of the presentations that were presented and if you should go through and watch them further. I'd love to hear from you in the comments down below. What was your favorite presentation that you saw from Basecamp, or what was your favorite takeaway? If you learned anything cool, I'd love to find out more about that because I mean, I'm always looking to take my game to the next level, so I'd love to hear from you about what worked for you. So, as always, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this, and I'll catch you in the next video. Thanks, guys.